Now, you mentioned that you grew up in New York. You grew up in the Bronx. Your parents were immigrants, and you grew up in a community that was low income. How did that experience shape your relationship with money, both before you started the zero-based budgeting and after?
So I think before I started zero-based budget, my mindset on money was I need to make sure I make enough of it.
Right.
And it was, I think, a pretty healthy relationship in the sense that I knew where my priorities were. And my priorities were always, I need to make sure that I'm able to provide for my family. I need to make sure that my parents never lack anything. And I need to make sure that I give back to my community. So those two things were always extremely important to me. And I think that because I grew up in a very low income community, I started my journey, I think, on a more positive note because I knew where my priorities were. However, I wasn't thinking about investing or long-term wealth or how to grow my money or how to even really accelerate my debt payoff so that I can have more to invest in myself and in my financial future. And I think it was after I created zero-based budget when I really started learning about money management. I started learning from, other content creators and other people in the personal finance space that I realized there's so much more to this than just make a lot of money. It's also know how to manage that money that you do make so that generations to come will never know what it's like to hover over the federal poverty line, which was where my family was basically my whole life growing up. I'd have to say that was probably the biggest shift.
Something I always find interesting about people who come from a lower income background or whose parents maybe are not as financially literate. So when I was a kid, we did not have a lot of money. We were definitely same thing, poverty line. And my parents have become more and more financially stable as I've gotten older and they've gotten older. But I've noticed that they still have a lot of, not fear necessarily, but skepticism around things like investments and these wealth vehicles that are a little bit more intangible. Like my parents, for them, their long-term wealth vehicle is real estate. And I think part of that is because my mother is very good at it. She's very good at, transforming properties. And it is, if you do it right, it can be a good way to make money in a short amount of time. But it's also fairly high risk. And it's also really, really labor intensive. And it's easy to not count, the labor that goes into it. But I think for them, there's something just very, very tangible about it. And it feels stable to them in a way that something like an ETF doesn't. And when I've talked to my parents about retirement, there is sort of that kind of barrier, which I think is partially generational, but I think also particularly because of that background of, precarity. And I can only imagine that is compounded if your family, if your parents are immigrants and therefore even less in access to all of these things, less educated about them, did not grow up with the American financial system. So what is your relationship now with your parents about money? Have you brought them into the fold about educating them on these things? What is their relationship with money like now?
Yeah, so, growing up, we didn't really talk much about money management, but what I did know about my parents is that they were very against debt, very, very anti-debt.
Same.
Because, and I think a big part of it is because, my mom's from Ecuador, my dad's from Honduras. Back in their countries, companies weren't super eager to extend credit the way they are here.
Yeah.
So, back home, my parents, if they wanted to purchase something, they had to save for it. That's just the way it was. Whereas when they came to the United States, all of a sudden, all these furniture stores are saying, no, put zero down and we'll happily extend credit to you. So that is one thing that I do think my parents always had, and I'm very thankful for them, is really their attitude, a pretty healthy attitude, I think, against borrowing money if you don't need it.
Right.
But when it came to education, that was, I think, their big exception.
Right.
And so that was definitely a good thing. What I will say though is that when I started my journey, I started telling my parents that I was really focused on, paying off my debt, and I created this like public platform where I was talking about how much debt I had. Like I was publicly putting out there that I had over $200,000 of debt. At first, my parents were like, "Honey, are you sure you want to do that?" Is that safe to talk about? And, things like that. So that was definitely one of, I think, the things that they were initially skeptical about. But then as I moved along my journey, they saw kind of what I was doing. It was all great. But the biggest thing I think that's been not so much of an issue, but something that I really had to sit down and explain to them is investing. Because my father has said, well, honey, now that you're done paying off your debt, you have to buy a house.
Yeah.
Like,
oh my God. My mom's greeting to me is like, hello, have you bought a house yet?
Yes. Like, honey, I saw this lot. It's an empty lot. It would be great for you and John. John is my fiance. For you and John to go ahead and invest in that and purchase. And I'm like, Dad, real estate in New York City is really, really expensive.
Yeah.
And so explaining to them that I was pretty heavily focused on trying to get into investing in the stock market and in this more passive approach that I take on investing in index funds, for example, was something that they didn't understand.
Right.
Like, first of all, what's an index fund? What is this investing in the stock market? Isn't that what collapsed, in 2008, 2009? Like that's what they're thinking, right? And I'm like, well, the housing market was
also a pretty big part of that.
A big component of it. So I think a big part of it has just been educating them on how investing works and how wealth building works in the United States. And I think that they've been very accepting of it, very excited when I can tell them now kind of like what I'm doing, what I'm learning along the way. Are they investing in the stock market? No, my parents are, they're like, that's for you to do. So it's not like they're eager to go ahead and start investing in the stock market. My parents are now enjoying their retirement as they should be. But yeah, I think that was probably the biggest thing. And I think with immigrant communities is just that exposure to what investing can do.